Hi, Misha here, and in my continuing look at attack aircraft of the U.S. military, ones with the A names, started off with the Douglas A-4 Skyhawk. Then we looked at the North American A-5, and now we're on to the VOT, or really LTV, because VOT merged with Ling Timco. A-7 Corsair, really Corsair 2. What an interesting graft, really. A neat design, and saw extensive use by the U.S. Navy, and honestly, by the U.S. Air Force. That's quite an interesting story, if I say so for myself. And also, for the first time on my channel, we've got a model from Gemini Jets, Gemini Military. This is still a 1/72 scale, and this is die cast. And sorry, it sits really high on the stand compared to like a Hobby Master, so I'm doing my best, but it's hard for me to kind of gauge where to point the camera. And if the stand and kind of plain style looks similar to, say, a Witty Wings or even a JC or Herpa, that's not a coincidence, but I'll get into that in a bit. So, where did the A-7 come from? You know, we have the A-4, which went into service in the late 50s and was the standard light attack aircraft, fighter bomber of the Navy in the first part of the Vietnam War. So why did we need this? Well, in 1962, the Navy started looking at a replacement for the A-4. They really wanted something with a larger bomb capacity, larger payload, and more range, and frankly, more advanced. In other words, the A-4 was just too cheap for them. They wanted something they could really dump money into. So in 1963, they outlined a new competition. And in addition to those requirements, mainly the payload, they had an interesting caveat. All the applicants, all the submissions, all the designs had to be based on existing airframes. Or I shouldn't say airframes, but existing designs. And the idea was this would speed up development. It would lessen R&D and, troubleshooting, save money, so on and so forth. So we have our usual companies submitting: Douglas, North American, Grumman, and VOT, aka LTV. Well, in February of 1964, the Navy announces VOT is the winner. And then a month later, they give the contract for further development and refining of the craft, and it's given the new designation of A-7. And VOT keeps working on it. And then the next year, they give the name Corsair. Now, VOT had already made a Corsair for World War II, which was quite famous. And they even had an earlier Corsair from the 1920s that's not that famous. But they liked the name, and I guess it was a bit of a good luck charm. And in fact, their design here, what became the A-7, was based on their F-8 Crusader, itself named after a World War II airplane. Now, the F-8 was a supersonic Navy carrier-based fighter. The A-7 was subsonic, still carrier-based, an attack aircraft bomber. Essentially, it is an F-8, but with a shorter nose, shorter fuselage, and a wider fuselage. It also was powered by the same basic engine that would be used in the F-111 Aardvark and the first series later on of the F-14 Tomcat. But it did not have an afterburner because this was a subsonic attack jet. And this had a lot of firsts for the Navy, which we will get to. And while it is bigger than the A4, it's about a 46-foot long plane, 46.5 feet long, with a just under 39-foot wingspan. As you see, or here, it's still quite small for a 1960s jet. The A-7 prototype first flew in September of 1965. Its development was quite smooth without major hurdles because, again, it's based on an existing design, and I think they just had their shit together. As a result, this would start to go into production at the factory in Texas, and by late '66, the Navy started to receive their first A-7s, known as the A-7A, and they would first have their original operational squadron in February of '67, and then the first squadron would be deployed on USS Ranger to Vietnam and would start to see combat by December of 1967, and very quickly some A4 units, A4 squadrons would be switched over to A7s. The original A7A was a good plane. It was good in the handling department, but it was considered to have an underpowered engine. It also had issues with stopping on slick or wet runways and some other taxiing things. So the A7B was very quickly introduced with the more powerful engine variant, and this really did help to correct some issues. However, these planes really had problems getting off the ground when fully loaded up, especially off carriers, even with catapult launches. But it was able to carry quite a bit more than the A4. It had originally a single barrel 20mm cannon. It had 6 under the wing pylons for ordnance, air-to-surface missiles, guided or unguided bombs. It also had 2 hardpoints on the fuselage for defensive air-to-air missiles, sidewinders, and the like. Again, though, these hardpoints weren't for bombs, they were just for that. Had a crew of 1, and had some very interesting electronics, which we will get to. In the end, the Navy would end up deploying 27 squadrons of A-7s in Vietnam, and just under 100 were lost in theater through combat and attrition and accidents and so on and so forth. It had a good record. Now, interestingly, the Marine Corps was not interested. They kept on using the A4, at least for quite some time, until the AV-8B Harrier was ready to go. But that's a story for another video. But the Air Force, well, I don't know if interested is the right word, but they certainly used the A-7. And there's a story in and of itself there. Ever since the Air Force was spun off and became its own branch from the Army had not been allowed by charter to operate fixed-wing aircraft. They could operate rotary blades like choppers, but the Air Force's purview was fixed-wing. And therefore, the Army relied on the Air Force for ground support, close support of its troops. And by the 60s, the Air Force was using kind of general purpose jets like the F-100 Super Sabre to do this. And the Army did not think these best fit the needs and best supported its troops. So it pressured the Air Force to adopt a specific attack aircraft for support. And the Air Force was not really keen on this. The Army had suggested the, at that time, up-and-coming A-7, which the Navy had just announced. The Air Force really didn't want to, but Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense, basically insisted, and therefore, in 1965, the powers that be in the Air Force announced they would be adopting a specialized version of the Corsair for use by the Tactical Air Command, TAC, and this became the A-7D. It had many important updates, for example, a new radar, new avionics, electronics. It had a new Gatling cannon, still 20mm, but now rotating barrels. It was the M61A1, I believe, and it held quite a few rounds, over 1,000 rounds. And most importantly, it had a more powerful engine even than the later A-7B. So, more powerful critter. And of course, it had Air Force's specific hardware like the refueling system they preferred and all that good stuff. Well, work began in the prototype. YA-7D flew in early February of 1968, and then the new souped-up engine was ready later that year, and it was tested with that. Accepted, and it went into service. And the Air Force started to deploy their variant in Vietnam in 1970. And originally they were used for actually search and rescue missions, supporting downed pilots as far as that goes, also helping trapped Army units, so on and so forth. They were also used as bombers, and they were very effective. A lot of the new electronics worked out very well. In fact, this had about the best record for the Air Force during the war. Only 6 aircraft were lost, and many, many thousands of sorties flown. It had about the best record for pinpoint delivery of ordnance, thanks to, again, its new electronics. And it really dumped a lot of pounds on North Vietnam, only really secondary to the B-52, which is obviously a much larger dedicated bomber. Well, seeing the success of the 7D, the Navy basically wanted one for themselves, and this became the A-7E. The Navy talked with Vought about this in '68, and by '69 a prototype was flying and was adopted into service. And again, it was essentially the same plane as the D, but it had the Navy specifics. Now, the A-7C was kind of a stopgap a few dozen planes, I don't know, 50, 60 planes were delivered to the Navy with the updates, but they still had the older B engine because they didn't have enough of the newer engines ready yet. So that's where the C falls in. What the Corsair had, for one thing, it was the first U.S. military aircraft to have a heads-up display HUD system. Now extremely common in military aircraft. It also had a data link system which allowed for hands-off carrier landings. Very advanced for its day. And it had a digital map system which allowed for an autopilot which was able to fly, again hands-off, to various waypoints. So it had a lot of automation going on for when it was in service. And again, it had quite the bomb capacity. The new Navy version would have the same Gatling cannon, replacing the single barrel. And these would be introduced into Vietnam around the same time as the Air Force. And they would be used concurrently. In fact, these were used extensively during Operation Linebacker in 1973. They were also used in what's referred to as the last battle of the Vietnam War, where a U.S. merchant ship, or a merchant ship I should say, was taken over by the Khmer Rouge. And both the Air Force with the 7D and the Navy with the 7E, the Corsairs provided air support and air cover during that mission. However, while this was a good plane, and while the Navy really liked what the Air Force had come up with the D, as soon as scaling back was happening as the Vietnam War started to wrap down, the Air Force already started to replace their Corsairs. This is because this wasn't really their decision. It was forced upon them by the powers that be. So when they had the opportunity, they selected a new plane, the A-10 Thunderbolt, aka the Warthog, which started to be delivered in 77. So from that time until 81, the Air Force was phasing out their planes in favor of it. We're giving them over to the Air National Guard. The Navy, on the other hand, still very much was using the Corsair. It would use the plane extensively during the invasion of Grenada and missions over Libya in 83. Meanwhile, the Air Force would put it to interesting use just because they were out of frontline service. They would use some during the whole F-117 project, about 24. These were used for both training of future F-117 pilots and also part of a deception plan to throw off spy satellites. Also interestingly, talking about government interference, while the Air Force really wasn't interested in the plane, in 75, Congress essentially bought new A-7Ds for the Air Force and gave them to them. This was kind of a make-work program for the Vought factory to keep it from closing. So not really having anything to do with them. They pretty much just gave them over to training and to National Guard units. And then in the late 70s, running to the very early 80s, a new variant was actually made, the A-7K, which was a two-seat dedicated trainer of the 7D. So even though the Air Force wasn't really keen on them, they would still keep getting them until the 80s. By this point, the Navy had updated most of their older 7As and 7Bs and the 7Cs to the 7E, the most advanced variant. which really had addressed a lot of the earlier shortcomings of the plane, and it was a great combat aircraft for what they wanted. The Air Force would deploy these, actually the Air National Guard I should say, during the invasion of Panama in '89, and that was pretty much its last active role. It would fly about 3 dozen sorties during that event, dropping a large amount of ordnance. And then the Navy would deploy the last couple of operational squadrons in '90 in Operation Desert Shield, and then they would be used in Operation Desert Storm in '91. And once that was over, the remaining Corsairs would be brought home in May and then decommissioned. So both the Navy and the Air Force would retire theirs officially after the Gulf War in '91, and the Air National Guard would very quickly join suit in '93. Thus ending quite a long and successful career. Major foreign users would be Greece and Portugal, with some other countries purchasing them in smaller numbers. In all, a little under 1,600 were made at the Vought LTV factory. Over a 15 plus year production run, so not bad at all. Not bad. And again, this had a lot of advanced avionics for its day and time, as well as a lot of support for hardware. But it was a subsonic jet. It would only get up to about 690 miles per hour. Which had the Air Force joking that it's not fast, but it is slow. And the Navy, somewhat affectionately, pilots called it the slough, short, little, ugly fucker. So it had kind of a, that kind of reputation. It was not the fastest, it wasn't a Top Gun, it wasn't an air superiority fighter, it was a ground attack fighter, and it did that very, very well. So there we have it. As far as this model, as I said, this is my first Gemini, or as the astronauts used to say, Jiminy, like Jiminy Cricket. This is essentially based on the old Witty Wings mold, but it has gear that can be up or down. It also has detachable ordnance. It comes with 2 missiles and 6 bombs. Has a crewman that you can put in. The canopy does open. The Gemini is very, very similar to the JC or even the Herpa version, with a few differences. For one thing, Herpa's double the cost, and I'm not really sure, maybe aside from a little bit better paint job, what you get. And while the JC is the same price, it does not come with a stand, but the Gemini here does. And actually, as much as I don't really care for the stand that goes with my MiG-29, which is a JC, I like this stand just fine. It's metal, and it plugs into the engine, and it's supported by the back. It seems to be reasonably stable. It's going to fall in a minute because I said that. The ordnance all plugged in fine. No real difficulties there. The only issue I have, and it's a minor one, my wing here on the right side, as you look at it, is just a little bit wiggly. I'm going to go in there and see if I can tighten something down, or maybe just stick just a tiny bit of glue. But other than a little bit of just minor play, it seems to be of good quality. I was kind of not sure. Anytime you get a new brand of these die-cast models, you never know what to expect. But I really wanted a Corsair, such a significant aircraft. It just wouldn't have been right. Plus it fits right between the A4 and the A10. In the Navy, This plane would be replaced starting in the 80s by the FA-18 Hornet. And in the Air Force, it would be replaced by the F-16, amongst others. Like I said, the A-10. Well, guys, I think we've gone on long enough. I appreciate you tuning in. Any questions? Feel free to ask them. If you could, like, share, and subscribe. Otherwise, I appreciate you tuning in, and I'll catch you very soon next time.